My name is Keith Mills, as indicated. There's something a bit wrong with my slide. Let me see if it's okay. Oh, no, there it is. So, thank you very much for coming to this afternoon's into the diaspora to a greater extent and the construct of rediscovering home. What I want to talk about is the way in which Caribbean people have been going to their various homes and doing so in massive numbers and having a significant impact on the Caribbean economy and particularly the Caribbean tourism economy. So I'll share with you some of the key findings that we've had. The research project, its approach was to look at particular Caribbean countries, we selected 4, and to look at their respective global cities where their largest diasporic populations are to be found. And so, we looked at Jamaica and London. We could have looked at Jamaica and New York, Jamaica and Miami, Jamaica and Toronto, Jamaica and possibly any other location, because there are Jamaicans to be found everywhere and in some sizable numbers. But we chose London. We looked at Dominican Republic and New York, and that was an obvious choice because the largest group of Dominicans outside of Dominican Republic are to be found not just in New York, but in specific locale in New York. And then Guyana and Toronto. Again, somewhat of an obvious choice. We could have looked at Guyana and New York, but Guyana and Toronto, the Guyanese population in Toronto is quite sizable in relative terms. And then Suriname and Amsterdam, again an obvious choice, but it's not just Amsterdam, it's actually Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. So although we have Amsterdam listed there, it's really the 3 major cities, and because they're not very far from each other, really, you're talking about one unit. Then we started plying through the data to find out, well, what's the size of these diasporic populations? How significant are they? Well, I knew the Dominican Republic had a large diaspora and a recent diaspora compared to Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, particularly in the English-speaking Caribbean. But I was quite surprised to know that Dominican Republic population here in New York is 9% of the population. This data from 2005, so I'm sure it's a little bit higher now. But it's also the largest group outside of the United States living in New York. They surpass the Chinese, which is only 6%. Okay, so the Dominican Republic is the largest diasporic community in New York. Then Jamaica and Jamaicans in London, 4%. We know that's an underestimation. We know this data is all underestimates, so I'm not targeting any one particular country. Guyana and Toronto, 3%. Suriname in the Netherlands. So this is the data we had for the Netherlands didn't break it down by city. This is for the whole of the Netherlands population. But if you do this kind of analysis by city, what you realize that, for example, in New York, if you added up all the Caribbean populations, we're probably somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population of New York, which is quite sizable. All right, and same thing in London, same thing in Toronto, Miami, etc. The other thing that we found, and which was a bit of a challenge from a methodological standpoint, is that how do you measure the size of the diaspora in terms of their travel to the Caribbean? Many people from the diaspora have passports from their new home territories. So when they identify themselves as they arrive, they may define themselves as Americans or Canadians or Italians or Swiss or whatever. And so there's that particular methodological challenge. So one of the things we've been using is a bit of a proxy, which is those who, the diaspora by and large stay with visiting friends and family, and they categorize them that way by our various tourism agencies. And through that data, we will get some ideas about the size. But also, we use another methodological approach, which is looking at ties too. So someone could be second or even third generation, or you could be married to someone who is from the so-called diaspora, which impels your travel. And so that person traveling could also be defined as part of the diasporic family. And so the data that we pull together is a bit of a mixed bag of methodologies. So from Dominican Republic, we think at max, you're looking at about 45% of the visitors, particularly through the airport in Santo Domingo. Whereas in Guyana, the numbers in terms of total arrivals of the diaspora to Guyana could be as high as 66%. And in Suriname, 62%, and in Jamaica, somewhere between 30 and 35%. These numbers are nothing to sneeze at. In fact, when we talk to many of the tourism agencies, they're quite surprised by the significant size of the diasporic arrival numbers. We also have some data, and again, this is drawn from some of the scholarly literature for various countries. I've only given you 3 of the Caribbean countries for which we have that data. Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Jamaica, and I have Ecuador in here just to give you some comparison. And so we know how many times people are traveling per year, whether it's 3 times a year, twice a year, once every 2 years, etc., etc. And what we see, for example, for Jamaica, is that the bulk of the travel is twice a year or once a year. Whereas for places like Guyana, it's once a year or once every 2 years. And Dominican Republic, it's twice a year and once a year. So you can see that there's an average of at least once a year or at least every 2 years, people are traveling to the region. Now I'll give you some examples from specific countries now. So for Suriname, the diaspora only represents 2% of the population of the Netherlands, but the diaspora relative to the home territory is 72%. It means that, and we also know this is a bit of an underestimation, so there may be as many Surinamese living outside of Suriname as in Suriname. And that's the case for many of our territories. So whatever the size of the Caribbean population is, those living in the littoral spaces called the Caribbean, you may well be able to double the size and say that the diaspora is almost at least equal to the size of the populations in the region. And this is data for Suriname, because they've been doing some fairly detailed visitor surveys there, and we were able to draw on that. And so when we say that 62% of the people who travel to Suriname define themselves as diasporic tourists, it's a combination of being either born there or having a family member who was born there or having some significant ties to that particular space. So this is all data giving trends for Suriname. And now for the Dominican Republic, the data particularly relates to visiting friends and family suggests that it's 14%. But many of the Dominican population living in New York have American citizenship. And so the data has been particularly difficult to get to. But we know that it's at least double that size based on other evidence that we've been able to draw on. I'll flip to the next one. In Jamaica's case, we only focused on the relationship between Jamaica and London. So it's the UK flows. The UK is a little bit different from the North American context in that people travel back to Jamaica from the UK less frequently than from North America. That has to do with the cost of airfare, it has to do with the relative purchasing power parity, a whole range of other factors, and the recently controversial issue of the airline passenger duties coming out of the UK would make this even more difficult. But again, we do know that from the UK, there's a significant share of travel back to Jamaica. So estimates of the 190,000 visitors from the UK to Jamaica annually, at least a quarter of them are from the diaspora. This is data for Guyana and Toronto. We've been able to do a more detailed survey in this particular territory. And here we were able to break it down by gender, the extent to which people have been living in Canada. So 74% of the people interviewed were living in Canada for over 20 years. To give you the age breakdown, in terms of those who travel back, number of first generation, number of second generation, how many times they travel back to Guyana, and the bulk of it is 2 times a year, and so on. And I'll flip through this as well. We came up with something called a typology of diasporic tourism. And this is where it became really interesting for us. At first, when we went into this research, we were largely looking for vacation-type tourism. And what we found was far more dynamic than that. Already we knew that there was things like events and festival tourism. In fact, I wrote a book on festival tourism some years ago. And for many festivals in the region, somewhere between 40 and 70% of the visitors who come for the festivals come from the diaspora. Okay, so I could give you data from various festivals all around the region. But we also found educational tourism. So people are coming back, maybe to even learn to play pan, as well as coming back for educational purposes. This was particularly the case in Trinidad when the government started giving, free education at the tertiary level. So in fact, some of my students, they would say to me, we've actually come back home for that purpose. And then there's business, which is quite diverse in many respects. I won't get into the details of it now. But we also found medical tourism, really strong in case of Suriname, and I'll give a little bit more details on that later on. And then heritage tourism, and so on and so forth. Because I wrote a book on heritage tourism a few years ago, and just sitting on the north coast of Jamaica one day, just talking to Jamaicans who had arrived, and many of them indicated that they came home and they spent half the time in Kingston, where they visit friends and family, and then half the time on the north coast doing the vacation thing, but also going to Duns Rivers Falls, going to the groves, the museums, plantation houses, etc., etc. All right, so the heritage tourism is also a strong element. What we also found is that the diasporic economy is very diverse, and tourism is but one component of it. And it links into trade in nostalgic goods and services. So you see the rise in sales of books, you see the rise in sales of pepper sauce when there's a festival, or when there are large numbers of diaspora returning home, like at Christmas or at other significant periods. We also found telecoms to be a really critical area, and I'll give an example of that in a few minutes. So that the relationship between the telecom sector and the tourism sector as it relates to the diaspora is very significant. Then there's travel, airline, and freight. I think that's fairly self-explanatory, but I'll give an example of that. Media, financial transfers, things like remittances, which we already know about. But let me give you one example of, this is one of my favorite examples. I did the research in Suriname, and I wanted to get a cell phone. So someone said to me, well, if you're going to the Netherlands next, what you should do is get a dual SIM card from Telesur. And I go, a dual SIM card? Yeah, and they said, if you buy this card and the phone from Telesur, you can call the Netherlands at a local rate, and when you're in the Netherlands, you could call back to Suriname at a local rate. And I was like, okay, wow. So I went and I bought the cheapest phone actually, but and it worked. But then I started doing the research on it and found out that over the space of 2 years, Telesur, which is the largest telecommunications company operating in Suriname and largely owned by the government, has almost 1% of the Dutch market in mobile. Now, people might say 1%, that's not a lot. Well, none of the other 45 providers of cell phone services in the Netherlands have more than 6 or 7%. So that Telesur's share is, again, nothing to sneeze at. It's very significant. But it illustrates that there is the potential for the diasporic tourism and telecoms market is very significant. And then there's Lepakan. Again, one of my favorite stories. Why? Because when I was a student in Canada and I was heading back home to Trinidad, who did I go to ship my barrel? Lepakan. But it was a few years ago, a good friend of mine asked me to, when I was traveling back from the UK to Guyana, to take something home for the family. And they were so happy that I arrived and so on. They invited me for dinner and then breakfast. And I had a breakfast meeting with the CEO of Lepakan, who was a family member. And then he started to list for me the achievements of Lepakan in the last several years. And I was completely astounded. Lepakan is a diasporic firm. It's the second largest employer after the government of Guyana. It has remittance companies, freight companies, airline company, and I could go on. It's in the port business, etc., etc., etc. And so we've been compiling a number of what we call diasporic firms and the kind of activities that they're doing. And so that the quantum of investment from the diaspora, or that is tapping into the diasporic market in the Caribbean, is very, very significant and under-researched, completely unmapped and undocumented. In many of our Caribbean countries, I would say that the key driver of our economies has been the diasporic economy. After tourism, I would say the next fastest important component of our economies is the diaspora economy. And the relationship between the two is something that we need to be paying closer attention to. So we have a whole range of policy recommendations. I won't go through them here with you now. But I'll just talk quickly about some of the key issues. One is strategic planning. As we say in the management field, if you can't measure it, it means you can't manage it. Now, you know how long I've been trying to do this research? About 7 years. I wrote the proposal for this 7 years ago. Because I've been tracking and mapping this diasporic phenomenon now for a long time. None of the key research agencies in the region were interested. None of the international agencies were interested. Finally, I got somebody to bite. If we don't do and fund our own research, we will be continually at the behest of other people. And then we complain, of course. But if you want to be strategic, you have to invest in your own sensibilities, your own interests. And I can't begin to tell you how much that's important. Mind you, this is my stock in trade, so I know I'm playing a little bit of a devil's advocate and playing close to home. But as from a strategic standpoint, we cannot push forward other people if we don't do our own strategic planning and investing in research. The second thing is this. What we found is that the notion that we have this diaspora as some homogeneous, clearly defined entity is very erroneous. It is very diverse, it's becoming even more fragmented and bifurcated. And what we mean by that is that the issue of ethnic decomposition is a critical factor, the aging of the diaspora, as well as going into second and third generations. And for example, in the case of Suriname, what we found is that some of the Indo-Surinamese population are actually investing more in India. Why? Because under the PIO program, Persons of Indian Origin program in India, somebody from Suriname who is at least 4th generation can invest in India, get a passport, and so on, get residency in India quite easy once they show the documentation. And so the diasporic phenomenon also has this ancestral component. And so we are now in competition, not just with other countries where there are new home territories, but even some of the ancestral homes for diaspora. We need to facilitate enterprise development, business planning, all those good things. But I want to go on to some more other aspects. Strategic marketing. We found it quite remarkable when we visited most of the tourism agencies, as well as the airlines, that in fact from a tourism standpoint, this group were not specifically targeted. In fact, I won't name the particular airline, but that airline depended to over 60 to 70% of their travelers from the diasporic economy. When I asked, well, have you ever marketed to this group? Do you spend any of your resources on it? And the answer was, well, no, these people always travel with us. And so we are not spending any money on them. We're going to Frankfurt and we're going to wherever else, and that's where we see the growth market. But what's interesting is this, is that when we interviewed the diasporic groups there, they were like, well, we know we have options. And we are now thinking we can travel to other locations, not just in the Caribbean, but outside of the Caribbean. So once you start to get into the second and third generation, the younger people are not viewing traveling home as a necessity. For them, it is now an issue of, well, what am I going to get for it? What's the quality of the experience, etc., etc. And so they can no longer be taken for granted. The issues of synergies between other sectors, financial transfers, tourism, telecoms, and so on, I think the point has been made. And things like nostalgic goods, etc. Just to give you an example, El Salvador, 10% of their exports to the United States can be defined as diasporic goods. And in fact, in their negotiations with the Americans for a free trade agreement, that was brought into the equation. So we haven't done the same kind of strategy in the Caribbean. We need to be thinking a little bit more about that. Last but not least, let me just talk a little bit about enterprise development. What we found was a number of entrepreneurs doing some fabulous things. In fact, in many instances, most of the more dynamic entrepreneurs in the Caribbean are people who are either moving back and forth between the diaspora and home, or they're tapping into the diasporic market in significant ways. We don't just mean individual entrepreneurs, but also, in some instances, large corporations, government-related organizations, and so forth. And so, what we would like to suggest or recommend is a greater focus on tapping into this particular market, but also facilitating this new breed of entrepreneurs who are expanding beyond the narrow definition of the Caribbean. In fact, one of the key things that we're making as a point in this research is that we should never talk about the Caribbean as a regional economy only, but look at the global, what we call the global Caribbean economy, which would include spaces like from Paris to Amsterdam, New York, Miami, Toronto, and so on. Now, I'll end on this note. Please forgive me if you think it's a bit of a plug, but Johnson did mention it. Part of the reason for me being here this week is that the chairman of Caribbean Tales Worldwide Distribution, which is a company that's based in Trinidad, with its board of directors, including people who are Trinidadian, Jamaican, Barbadian, and so on. We are running the festival, the film festival, on a weekend, Saturday I think it is. And, well, our CEO is here with us, Francis Ann Solomon, as well as Mary Wells, who's one of our directors. And we are targeting the diasporic market in a very deliberate way, not just only to sell and distribute our products and services, but also to target diasporic filmmakers, for example. This is an example of the kind of business enterprises we are seeing all around the region now and in the diaspora. But this is not possible without a number of things, like venture capital formations, without training people to be able to tap into these kinds of markets and so on. So the point is, I think we are onto a good thing. Our diaspora communities have been making a significant and tremendous contribution to our economies. It needs to be better recognized. It needs to be better mapped and documented. And I want to end on the note by arguing that I think as a people, particularly in the context of a global economic recession, this is where our strategy begins. And so discovering home, I think, is an apt banner for this kind of work that the CTO is doing, as well as the range of other diasporic entrepreneurs and activists. So I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. And if you are so interested, my presentation and much of the findings from our research will be available on our website, which is history.rappelcenter.org. So thank you very much.